Welcome to Frequently Speaking. This is your host, Maxwellness. Now, here on this podcast, we're going to start to break down words that we speak outwardly and how their vibrations create what we frequently see. Now, in today's episode, we're going to delve into taming the truth. Thank you. All right, welcome guys. Thank you for tuning in to Frequently Speaking. So today I'm with lovely Christine out in beautiful Costa Rica, where we actually met. And today we're going to bring to you a topic that we both share, but Christine is super prevalent in. And before I give her this amazing introduction, and then she also expands a little bit more into the details of what she does, this is going to be all about taming the truth. And taming the truth in a sense of what is actually truly at our center, where we root into our authentic expression and also our authentic belonging in this world and also other worlds. Now, Christine works with children. She's worked with children her whole life. She's built a long, extensive career through neuroscience, through behavioralism, and a lot of other different facets, but really bringing that heart-centered, what I think is truth to parenting, but also a level of conscientiousness of what love can actually look like in allowing something to grow naturally and allowing this sense to become wild and tune in to what that wildness is, and also rewriting these aspects of what we see as what wild is and how it can actually express naturally. And I say all that to say is our children are these little seeds that are growing, whether they have diagnosed behavioral disorders, cognitive disorders, emotional disorders, whatever it is. They're all children and they're all special in their own way. And Christine has this way of just seeing that and really whispering to that little aspect that is in that seed to actually get it to grow, and also speaking to the parents to see how they can nurture and nourish their children as they're going through these processes. So without further ado, I want to actually bring Christine to give a little bit more of a detailed point of who she is now, what brought her to being here, and also the things in which we resonate with so much that we connected in Costa Rica to actually bring about this meeting here today. So, Christine, give us a little bit more.
Thank you so much. What a nice introduction. And yeah, for sure, we'll have to tell that story of how we connected. It's super prevalent to this. Let's see. I'm a dreamer, an adventurer, a neurointegrative educator, and inner child liberator. And I'm working on a few other titles for myself right now. But yeah, I've been living in Costa Rica for the last year and a half. I'm originally from Jersey, and I lived in Oakland, California for 12 years before I moved here. So yeah, where should I even start? Like my work background, is that?
Yeah, maybe give like a little preface to where you are in Costa Rica and the things that you're doing, and also like just a short version of the path that took you there, because a lot of what we're really going to share is also a distillation to come up to your present moment, which you're like in transition and you're transforming. So I feel like, I know a lot of that background, but maybe some like checkpoints of how you actually bridge and connect that neuroscience and spirituality, that wildness with that appropriation, and all of these different aspects that brought you in from that love of children.
Yeah. So, okay. I studied speech therapy in college because even when I was a kid, I knew I wanted to work with kids, and I didn't want to be a teacher. So I said, okay, I'll study speech. I'll have my own practice. And it was there in my senior year in Boston. I was working at a stuttering clinic for adults who, could barely, it would take us an hour to do an introduction, where we just said our name and one thing about the week, because these people really, really stuttered with with everything that they would say. And it was while I was in school, this man, I remember him coming up to me after the group and telling me about this thing called Reiki, and that this was the only thing that helped him with his stutter. And so even then, as I was, really in my academia and studying and knew I was going to go onto grad school, this man like planted the seed for me. And I remember thinking like, if this is benefiting him and helping him, and this is energy, and it's anyone can do this, like, why am I not learning this in school? So even though I was on an academic trajectory for a long time, I had these little points all along the way that were starting to open my eyes to alternative ways of approaching healing, of approaching, supporting the body and the nervous system. And so then I moved to California and I started working at a school for kids who were deaf and hard of hearing. But I think all of them also had other comorbidities and diagnoses. So I got to work really closely with kids that were autistic and had ADHD and different processing disorders. And it was a very small classroom, so I got to know them and their families really intimately. And that was when I started to really realize that a lot of things that I learned in school were based on this behaviorist model, right? Where it's from the 50s, from B.F. Skinner, who said like, oh, well, what we see is what's happening, right? We can observe the behavior, so we should correct the behavior. And so that was so much of the philosophy that I learned back then, was to fix these aspects of these children and to get them to change so that they can adapt into the normal, typical, quote unquote, world. And I remember experiencing a lot of their behavioral challenges that would show up in the classroom. And it was daily frustration. Like, these kids had really, really high needs. And a lot of the things that we did in the classroom, even though it was so small, it wasn't easy for them to do. It was frustrating every single day. And so I watched them. This one little boy changed my life forever. And I just got invited to his 18th birthday party when he was 5 or 6 when I was working.
That's a perspective.
Right. Now I feel old. But he was born deaf and he had cochlear implants. And so basically it's a surgical procedure where they will drill a hole in the back of your head and they attach a magnet and a chip, and that picks up vibration and sound. So it bypasses your eardrum so that you could hear through vibration in your skull. But the magnet you could take on and off. And so Mickey, when he would get frustrated in class, he would take off his ears, he called them, throw them across the room, take off his socks and shoes and shut his eyes like this, really, really tight. And you couldn't talk to him, you couldn't get through to him. And it was a breaking point for me in my career, because I just remember thinking like, this is no way for a child to be in school. Like, he's not learning, he's not processing, he's not enjoying this experience at all if he's constantly in this state. So it really got me questioning the way that I learned things. And then also in that experience, I started working really closely with the parents. They were coming in and out of the classrooms every day. And it started to feel like I took on like a therapy role with them. They started sharing the depths of the things that they were going through with me. And I realized, well, the kids have this special school. They had all these after school programs, these different therapies. And I remember one day looking at this mom and being like, but what about you? Like, what do you have? And at the time, there wasn't really anything that any of them were doing to take care of themselves, to learn some of the things that I noticed I was applying with these kids. When I started changing what I did, when I started changing my perspectives, when I changed my expectations of them, when I built their trust and started to see them for who they truly were without trying to change them in any way, there were these huge, profound shifts in their behaviors and their abilities to learn and take in information. It was incredible. Like, over the course of a year, I saw so much change and so much progress. And it started with me. I had to change how I showed up with them as their teacher.
Right.
And so I just realized, well, if the parents aren't also on board and it's not happening at home, there's this incongruency, and that's not what's in the
Mhm.
best interest of the child. So that is what inspired me to go back to grad school, not for speech therapy, but for integrative health studies. And so that's where I started really studying neuroscience, mindfulness, all kinds of things that integrate the brain, body, spirit connection.
Mhm.
And I thought, okay, this is the modality that I want to work with parents. I want to help them connect more deeply to themselves, to understand themselves, so that they can better understand their kids and come
Mhm.
with this place of pure curiosity and compassion, rather than trying to change who they are, right? And let go of maybe some of those expectations and hopes that they had for this child that isn't actually real. It's not the child who's in front of them. So that really started this whole journey. And now that's the work that I started doing here in Costa Rica. I've done some parenting series here. I have one-on-one clients that I work with in person, and it really is coming from that place that if you really want your child to change their behaviors, and you're coming against these power struggles and constant conflicts, or a relationship is between two people, or more than two people, but it's at least two people. And I guess you can have a relationship with yourself, but there's parts there too, right? So how do you look within as the adult, as the caretaker, as the one with the developed prefrontal cortex, to do this work so that you can show up differently for your kids, and then the changes happen?
Wow. Wow. Oh my gosh. Talk about inspired action. Oh my God, I love that. And there was so much in that I saw in the sense of you learning from the base of, this behavioral aspect, from this Skinner guy back in the 50s, and just looking at it so superficially and looking at it from that perspective lens, and then, teaching a bunch of therapists and really setting out this frequency of, oh, this is how you change the behavior. But it's like he's only looking from that one layer of a child, and it's like, what do you do with all those other children? And it's kind of like, you took that base and that foundation and started to shift it into your own perspective, with allowing those those other things to come in, with the Reiki, with the your own passion, the connection to energy, the curiosity that allowed you to like see these other ways. And it's like that curiosity almost broke that conditioning of not to only look at our children through behaviors, but also like deeper. And I want to come back and circle back to that, but it was like you took this sense of like joy and play and fun, and was like, yeah, these children aren't learning if they're not able to enjoy this. And I'm 100% a believer of learning through joy, learning through play, learning through fun. Like, that's how we develop neuroplasticity. That's how
Mhm.
we're not necessarily like developing our memory brain just to memorize something, but we're actually recalling and using those higher faculties from that play. um, so I see how that can definitely be tied into what have. One of the labels that you've held for yourself is like the wild whisper, is like that sense of being wild is for us to really truly play and
Mm.
allow ourselves to be like nature, and look at these things naturally. Like, you saw this kid of, taking off his ears and taking off his feet, and like closing out all of these sensory things. And I feel like that is what so many of us do nowadays, whether
Mhm.
it be with social media, whether it be with our headphones, whether it be, locking ourselves in our room and just, focusing on one thing. I know work is good or whatever, but locking ourselves away and finding those senses of isolation to like push out those sensory things, because these things are appropriate for right now. And just like you said, with that relationship to ourself, it's almost like, as you were saying, that it was like this invitation to these parents back to themselves and back to that inner child through their children. And I think that that's amazingly powerful. And also, this, what it just awoke in me was this real, I guess, like spectrum of what it means to not only be wild, but also what it means to be true, what it means to be authentic, and also like how these children, even these adults that were stuttering, find belonging in the world. You know, if the world has been so conditioned that, oh, I see this behavior, I need to fix it, and it's like this self critic that's inside saying that, oh, behavior doesn't fit the outside, so therefore it doesn't belong and it needs to be fixed. But it's like something I always share with my clients is in the sense of when we're building healthy habits, it's like a habit is something that's here, a behavior is here, an action is here, but behind the habit is what we truly feel. What is our actual feeling? And then that creates the habit. But then outside the habit, when we're continuously doing that, we have this behavior, and that's how we behave. And then our behavior is created by that action. So it's like this kind of ripple effect that happens, you know, when we feel something inside, then we create it out. And it's like you're looking at it from this other aspect of how can somebody look at that conditioning or that action that this child is doing and really look back into themselves and say, okay, how is that making me feel as a parent? Why I need to fix them. So I want to ask you in this sense, right? Like you said about these parents having these, we all know we're conditioned. We all know that we're programmed and all these things. And we're doing all our healing for ourselves. But for the parents out there and also the people that want to become parents, how, yeah, let me say it this way. How can one, as they're undoing that conditioning, also tap into the wildness that's within? So I guess that question to you would be, what do you see as wild, and like what does wild mean to you? Because so many people have a conditioned mindset or a preconceived idea of what that may mean. So what does it mean to you?
Absolutely. Yeah. Part of the reason why I call myself the wild child whisperer is this reclamation of the wild child, right? Wild maybe means one thing, but wild child, it usually has this negative connotation. They're the troublemakers, the instigators, the rebels. And so I'm like, yeah, like what are we actually rebelling from, you know? And I think also part of the reason why I was so drawn to this work and working with these children is because I saw myself in them. And I think for me, you know, my childhood, my mom died when I was 10. And so my dad raised my brother and I lost a lot of who I am. I lost a lot of that wildness. In my childhood, I had to grow up really fast. And so I think part of what I saw in these children was this correction, these like trying to fix them, was this act of taming them, right? To me, wild is who we are when we come into this world in our pure sense. Like wildness is authenticity. It is the ability to express ourselves exactly as we are. And I feel that really deeply, like as yeah. Yeah, that's how I see wildness. It's just this true expression of yourself. And I think because of that conditioning that you're speaking of, because of these societal standards, and yes, I agree with you to a point that some people are starting to wake up and question, like, what are these societal conditions? What are these familial conditions that I may or may not be consciously subscribing to? You know, I think for so many of us, it's again, like I use the word normal with so much sarcasm, but if things become normalized and we don't even realize, like the fish out of water analogy, right? Like we're so inundated in it that we don't really see that it's our reality. And so there's a lot of people that don't question these standards that we're actually upholding. And so I think part of that is like this peeling back of who we actually are at our cores. Like when we are babies, we cry when we need something. We are completely genuine and true. There is no facade that babies have in terms of their personality. You're like, oh, I don't want to cry because I don't want to upset mom, or I don't want to wake up mad, or they just do the thing. They are purely themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, we become more and more conditioned. It could be by family, it's often by parents, but it's often by peers at school when you hit a certain age where you get to this point. And I learned this from Dr. Gabor Mate, where he speaks of these two beliefs, these two truths that we have as these two needs
Mm-hmm.
as people, as humans, and as kids. And one of them is belonging, and the other one is the need for authenticity. And so we come into this world authentic, and over time other people's conditioning starts to play a role in who we are and who we become, and we start to be shaped by other people's perceptions, by what other people by how parents give and receive love and acceptance, right? It becomes like, oh, I love you if you're a good girl. I
Right.
will go to timeout and I don't want to see your face again until you do this, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so we start to push kids away. We start to learn that, okay, in order for me to belong, I have to give up these pieces of who I am, these pieces of what I'm actually feeling inside. I have to hide these parts of myself so that I can fit in, so that I can be accepted by my parents, so that I don't get bullied at school. And so it becomes this dance of choosing one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, I think a lot of people, especially in our generations, chose belonging, which is also really, really important. You know, it's how we
Yeah.
survived for a really long time. We needed that sense of community. We couldn't be excommunicated. It was life or death for such a long time. And so we chose to belong, but we gave up these pieces of who we are. So yeah, part of my own journey, my own work is coming back to those pieces and rewilding myself,
Mm-hmm.
finding all those parts along the way that I not intentionally discarded, but that I replaced, or that I covered up, or that I hid, or that I buried like so deep down that when they come up now, I'm like, oh, like you've been there the whole time. Okay, cool.
Right.
Nice to meet you.
Oh my gosh, I love that. I love that, and just thank you also too for that vulnerability of how those things can be buried, within yourself, and then also things that you've noticed, since your mother's passing, and like, being raised with your father and your brother, and that aspect. I feel like so many of us that are parents now have been through that and have been conditioned in that way to have this relationship to growing up so fast, like adulting so fast. And even in that concept, it's like, how do we develop our own consciousness to see and be and acknowledge that within ourselves, to also see how we're projecting that onto our child. And I feel like that's where that taming comes in. And as we spoke about this before, like a few weeks ago, and we were coming up with this concept, it's like we're playing with it and really seeing how this sense of truth, whether it be in the world, whether it be in yourself, whether it be in your child, whatever the case is, that these conditions are moving through us. And like, how can we cleanse and transform and become conscious about how we're pushing it back out into the world? Just like, this Skinner guy is taking his perception and just placing it back out in the world, and keeping that relationship going so that people consistently think in that mindset. So it's also like inviting these parents to do exactly what you're doing, is like inviting them back into that wildness to themselves, so that they're able to see their children through the deficiencies, through the disorders, through the diagnoses, and all of those things, and connect with them. You shared something about Gabor Mate, and this is the part where, like, I always love our conversations, because I feel this, like, I love Gabor Mate, right? And I have my own perspective, and I always receive the things the position that he comes from. And I see that sense of, from a biological standpoint, right? Like, that's where my background is, right? And then going into, psychology and all these other things. But the biology, like I know that that is my medicine, like that is the body, like those are the languages that I speak, and I have a really good way of like translating those. And I remember when he said that, and automatically I thought of the central nervous system. And this is something that we spoke about. It's like these two different rhythms that our central nervous system has. And for us, it's all about like balancing that. And that's how we have like regulation and dysregulation. You know, we have parasympathetic, sympathetic, we have, you know, reactive, responsive, all these different things, but it's that complete oscillation between the two. And I feel like as children, as we're born into the world, right? Like even with my experience, being in that fight or flight or that reactive state that was placed on, you know, me in the conditions of my environment, of the conditions of like my mom placing those things on me, all these different things, the children are just absorbing that. So it's like that's what the central nervous system is programmed to. So if it's programmed to that, you still have that connection and that belonging over here, but we don't really get to explore that calm and responsive and sympathetic state, parasympathetic state of belonging and authenticity. So it's like we really have to shift that scale for our children to get them to experience that. And I feel like internally it goes into the body. And those are things like that we think about, of just like how you were saying, like those things come up for you and you're like, wow, like you were there all that whole time. And it reminds me of another book, you know, The Body Keeps the Score. And it talks all about that, about how our central nervous system, how our body, our muscles, our connective tissue, all of these things store the experiences that it has. So it's like what I see in your position, in your career and in your passion, in your life's work, is that it's looking at the parents and how they are actually conditioning and parenting their children, yes, on the outside, but also tuning their children. You know, how are they tuning their child's central nervous system to, yes, like I may say the right things to you because I heard my therapist, or, you know, Gabor Mate, or I heard this lady on Instagram talk about it, or, you know, Christine told me, and I'm going to tell my child this thing. But it's also like being present with your energy.
Yeah.
Because if you're saying it and you have this internal frustration that you're trying to hold in, but you're like, yes, honey, that's great that you're doing that, and I really support you in that. It's like that child is going to feel that energy and that charge, and then it's like, how are you being authentic? So when I look at that, right, I could see a challenge that some people may have, in a sense of, as we're adults and, you know, in this hypothetical situation, you know, we've grown up too fast. We're coming back to our child. We're also healing from our conditions and our process and our perspective and all of these things. How does one really come to that moment, before we get to that present moment in time when something's happening with the child, neurologically and also emotionally? Where does that naming of the belonging and authenticity come from? Because if I, as a parent, don't have that understanding, and what I'm, you know, my central nervous system scale is kind of tuned this way, and I have this sense and I've learned connection and belonging this way, and it hasn't been authentic, and it hasn't been, excuse me, I don't mean to say connection. That was something I'm going to tie in later with Gabor when we shift the scale. But authenticity and belonging, if I don't have that pure and like wild child aspect of myself, where does that naming come from to what I'm relating to authenticity and belonging? Like, where do those parents name that, and how can they shift the naming of it?
That's a really interesting question. I think it ties to what you were speaking to just a few minutes ago, about how you said, you know, when the parents, this happens all the time with my clients. So they're like, yeah, like I tried that. I do that all the time. It just doesn't work. And I could see it in their body language. I can hear it in the way that they're trying to say what they want to say, that there is this incongruency between their energy, their body language, and what's actually coming through with their words. And kids pick up on those subtle signals. Like, so much of our communication is done via body language, right? And actually, the majority of parents, even first-time parents who have no idea what to do with the baby, they understand this practice of co-regulation. Right? So kids don't have the ability to regulate their own nervous systems. It's something that develops in the brain, and it happens over time as we get older, and a lot of it happens in the prefrontal cortex of our brain. And so, and we are like the longest out of like all the animals in the animal kingdom, right? Humans need their parents for the longest amount of time. We depend on our caregivers more than any other mammal or creature. And that's because we don't have this ability to regulate our own, well, one of the reasons, to regulate our own nervous system. So we really rely heavily on the adults in our lives to help us get back to that state of presence, of calm, of, okay, we're not in danger anymore. And so most parents, I would say, can co-regulate successfully with babies without really having to think about it or label it, or is this authentic? Is this not? Right? And most of the time, even if moms are stressed or going through postpartum or they're flustered, they know when the baby's crying, right? We instinctively have these tools in our body to rock or to hum or to sing. And those are somatic practices that somehow are still, passed along on a pretty subconscious, intuitive level, I think, for a lot of parents. Like, okay, we actually do know how to co-regulate with babies, and we know how to be authentic and present, and that we're going to accept this baby exactly as they are. And then I think there comes a certain point where maybe the kids hit 3 or 4 or 2, depending on how expressive the child is. Yeah. Which is my favorite age, but where I was talking to a friend last night, and she said, Christine, like, whenever I see your posts, like, it feels like I'm hearing from this like older child version of myself that's speaking to this like younger part of myself. And she has a young toddler. She's like, she's always talking, and she's always like triggering these deep parts of me. And she connected it back to, how she was raised in her childhood, and what her dad would say to her when she was talking too much, and how that wasn't acceptable in their family, and how much shame was placed upon her for expressing herself, right? So I think that labeling that you're talking about, it comes when the kids start to show, when they start to mirror the parts of their parents that weren't able to express themselves when they were kids. And so it becomes this trigger for them, where they see themselves in their kids. They might not be able to notice that that's what's happening, but they notice that there's something like really disorienting and dysregulating and bothering about what's happening. And they may or may not make that connection, like, oh yeah, it's because I can see myself in them. Yeah. But I think that's the piece, or maybe it's not even within the parent, but it's a lot of judgment that other people have, right? So maybe you bring your kids out in public, and because I work with a lot of families that have autistic and neurodivergent kids that don't express themselves in the same way that other kids might, or they might be constant stares from strangers or judgments that they're getting, right? And you have to parent these kids in different ways. And so other people have a lot of criticisms and things to say about parenting, especially in today's society. Everyone has an opinion about how you should be a parent. And so I think it's also that like outcoming, this incoming pressure from the outside, where then the parents question their own authenticity and their own sense of belonging, right? Well, I want to be part of this community. I don't want to feel othered from the other parents. I want to fit in. I want to have friends. I want to belong. I don't want my kid to be different than the other kids. So then it becomes about their own authenticity and their own belonging, and then it's projected onto the kids. So I think that's another big aspect of this.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm so glad you brought up that point. Because that, I feel like personally, that is where that naming comes from. It comes from us, period. It's like when we think of those fears, and you said this thing about like when your friend's child is like saying these things and these triggers pop up, I like to look at it as like, rather than triggers, like I call them flared imprints, because it's almost like this solar flare that pops out of you. But for me, I see the opportunity in that is to like shift, because these things have been imprinted on us as we've been children, like that same fear of, oh my God, I'm not going to belong. Oh, I'm out in the world, my kid is acting up. It's like, quite frankly, fuck all that. You know, like, be here with your kid, you know,
Yeah.
be here with your child in this moment in time and connect. That's it. Like, this imprint, you may see it as, oh my God, it's triggering me, and you start getting, but that just curls your body up and you
Yeah.
go into that reactive state. That doesn't help anybody. You shut down, then you enable this kid, and then you start giving them everything that they need to do because you just want to pacify them because they're out in the world and you don't want to look at anybody because it's your own fear, and you shut down rather than opening yourself up to that opportunity to see, okay, like this is an invitation for me to be authentic. Oh wow, I'm actually looking at myself like I don't feel like I belong, and that opportunity for yourself can actually shift not only yourself but also your parenting. It can shift your child. And this same aspect of what you were saying of like when our children speak these things, like I have a client of mine that, you know, we talk about this in a sense of how our children are doing these things, right? Like we looking at the behaviors. And I was basically explaining to him, you know, the inner work that we've done for yourself, where you're able to see your actions, your behaviors, your habits, and then your feelings, you're able to see that ripple effect, and you see how it affects you and how you can shift it to see, okay, I can shift my feeling to change my habits, how I connect to my habits, how I relate to my behaviors, and how I actually work out into the world and do action, and that can shift myself. Now also you got to understand that once that action is out there and it hits a wall, which is your child, and that mirror, that reflection, and it comes back to you, you have to be able to receive that as well. And we speak about, like we had went through this one, a few sessions, through the things that he was noticing in his daughter and how how he was receiving them. And he's like, yeah, you know, I feel guilty. I feel, you know, ashamed. I feel all of these things. And then I just made the connection for him. Like, those are the same feelings that you felt when you were younger, when the things that you couldn't express. And now there may be some level of jealousy. There may be some level of anger that your child is expressing, the things that you didn't express when you were a child. And now you're looking at them through that lens rather than looking at them. And then, not to say rather, but what we come to find out is that there's a medicine there, so that, you know, whether if it's jealousy, whether if it's anger, you label that emotion, and then you say, oh, like that's the emotion that I'm giving back to her. That's the energy that my body language has. That's the energy that I'm giving her when I'm saying these things. So I'm changing the action, but I'm not changing the feeling, you know, so the habit and the behavior doesn't change, because there's a disharmony, or, you know, like a distension between the two. So when we're looking at how we receive that from our children, we have to have that emotional intelligence to receive back everything that we poured into them. If I poured in this anger into my child, now my kid is acting out and they're being angry. Oh my God, I don't know why they're angry. You're not taking accountability for the actions that they gave you. They're giving you back the energy that is not theirs. It's not theirs. They're giving it right back to you, and you don't want to take it back. So then they take it and they're like, this is not mine. And they're continuously trying to do that. It's like they're emptying out this cup that we've poured in. So I feel like that sense of how we name what this energy is that we're giving to this child, is it coming from that imbalance, like fear state of what we connect to and how we relate to belonging in the world. And, you know, my child is acting up, and like you said, I don't want them to be seen like this, because that's going to be a reflection on me. We have to be honest with ourselves and say, oh well, that's how I'm connecting to belonging, rather than boom, how do I belong as a parent? How do I belong in my child's life? How can I belong right here, right now, with my child, with this emotion, and meet it in the same level of authenticity. It's like, oh, well, this isn't really an authentic expression. I don't want to keep coddling them and pacifying them, but I have to do this because I just need them to shut up right now because we're outside and we're in the mall or we're in, you know, a place where you're supposed to be quiet. It's like you feel all of that pressure and energetically you just shut down and you create this for this child. And when I look at it from a biological standpoint, that's really what happens. When your body shuts down, then you react from this state. When we can learn how to shift that and say, okay, how can I authentically show up to what my child is giving me right now? And do I have space? Do I have the capacity to say, okay, this is an authentic expression from my child. They're upset. Okay, let's be here with this upset. Let's get to the root of this and then shift it and allow it to move. Because then our child doesn't develop biologically and neurologically the pathways, the neurological pathways, the emotional pathways of this chemical, like you said, this regulation. So I feel like what you were saying with the parents instinctively knowing, like mothers knowing when to rock, knowing when to hum, whether to coddle, whatever it is, you know these things instinctually. But sometimes parents, if you're not naming what that authenticity is, what that belonging is, what that fear is, what that anger is, if you're not naming those things, and not just simply naming them and labeling them, it's like learning how to respond once you name them, then you're going to consistently keep this cycle going, you know, and it's going to be this consistent power struggle between you and the child, when it's really a surrendering and opening yourself up to give yourself more space for this child as well, you know. And I feel like that's one of the things that brings in this sense of, like, yes, you said this wild child. And I think that is one of the shadow aspects that we feel of, we're not allowed to go into that wild child, you know, aspect of this world, because yes, we were growing up too fast and we have to be an adult and everything has to be appropriate and we're supposed to be doing this. And it's like, when you look at that as long and extensive and experiential your path has been and your journey has been, where do you feel like neuroscience opens up this state of authenticity in that way?
Yeah, I like the way that you led into that question. I mean, neuroscience, what's really cool, like we've been talking about B.F. Skinner, right, and behaviorism, and that was like in the 50s. And so that was all we could do because it was all we could see. And it wasn't until fMRIs were developed in like the early 80s that neuroscience even became a field that we could study. We didn't know how the brain operated. We could look at it, but we didn't know what lights up. We had no idea. I mean, I take that back, because so many indigenous and ancient cultures knew about the mind-body connection for a long time, right? But it's this blending of science where we can definitively say, here's actually what is happening in the brain. Here's what we see it. We can study this. And so, yeah, like it really changed so much of how we understand ourselves, our behaviors, our nervous systems, this connection that we have between what's happening in the brain and what's happening in our body, and coming back to this sense of wildness, to me, and neuroscience, again, it's like the relationship between our brain, our nervous system, and our behaviors, thoughts, and actions. And so, like you're saying, if parents are living in this state of disconnection where it's not even that they can't label their emotions, it's that I'll share, like, I didn't have an awareness of my emotions for a really, really long time until I started doing this deep work, and I started, therapy and healing like over 10 years ago. You could ask me, well, how are you feeling in your body, or where does that emotion show up for you? And I had no idea. I really couldn't tell you. There was such a disconnect for me, even like, oh, that the food I am eating is impacting how I feel or how I look. Like I really didn't have that awareness of it. And so, of course, if you don't have that awareness as a parent, then when your child shows those emotions, it's not safe for them, because if it's not safe for you and you can't hold that yourself, how are you supposed to hold the emotions of another person, right? And that was my experience. Like when my mom died, it was kind of, okay, let's go back to the way things were. And we don't really talk about it. Like, don't cry. If you're going to be sad, like, go in your room and do that by yourself. Like, there's no room to do that here. And so everything for me got pushed down. I wasn't witnessed in my grief at all. And so I became really disconnected. I lived in that state of fight or flight for a really long time. And so we know now through neuroscience that that is like the more primal part of our brain, right? That was like developed first because we needed it. And so at some point, it becomes a survival strategy for you. And so, can you hear me okay, by the way? They're doing landscaping. Okay. It becomes survival. And so for me as a kid, I had to learn how to shut those parts of myself down because it wasn't safe to fully express myself as I was, right? And so that's what these kids are learning. Like, okay, it's not safe to fully be authentic. It's not safe to show the spectrum of my emotions and what I'm really feeling. So I'm going to hide these parts of myself. And the parents are co-signing on that, right? Like, okay, well, yeah, don't show that. Like, I don't know what to do with it.
I never did it either.
Exactly. So in some ways they're a mirror, and in other ways, like, yeah, the kids are really showing parents what maybe they haven't been able to see in themselves. So it's even like an AI mirror or something, or like an X-ray mirror, where it's like really digging down to these parts that parents have of themselves that they didn't even see or recognize for a long time. But neuroscience to me is like, I think the understanding of why regulation is so important has changed. I mean, even the field of behaviorism has been around in a long time in the autism community, because the number one strategy for helping kids with autism is a therapy called ABA therapy. And it's basically behaviorism in a nutshell. It's like, okay, how do we get these kids to adapt to the outside world by changing them? And so, yeah, now what we're learning is the behaviors that these kids are exhibiting are really the tip of an iceberg. And what we see is what's observable. That's the action. That's how the way that they're expressing themselves. But now, because we're able to study the brain and the nervous system, we see that underneath it, that's where all the juicy stuff is. That's where the root of all the problems are. And so we're just, punishing kids for bad behavior over rewarding them when they're doing something good. We're not doing anything to address the root of what's happening underneath it. Why are they dysregulated in the first place? Why do they feel like they want to escape their body because there's danger ahead of them? And they're restricted and they're stressed and they're living from that place that's dangerous and I'm not safe. And so there's so many of the traditional strategies that we've had for kids up until this point aren't actually effective, because it's like putting a Band-Aid on the root of what's going on. And so neuroscience highlighted all of that, I think, for us to show us that, hey, there's really a lot more happening underneath the surface, and here's some science to back up what we're saying.
Right. I love that aspect. And yeah, I feel like that answers the question so like profoundly and just blows it open, like wide open, because it's like when you look at that aspect, what I see and what I hear in that is like something that I always approach through spirituality is this sickness that comes with the Western concept of, and it's mental health at the end of the day. It's how our mind was so conditioned to think that it brought all of this energy in your spirit and your being to live here. You're living completely by what you think, what you see. Everything is superficial. You're living at that top of the iceberg, as you say. And when you talk about that root and going down and connecting, it's exactly what you were sharing before, and what you kind of touched on was this knowledge and this true understanding and this real wisdom indigenous peoples and tribes have known this for thousands of years, that everything is one. But in reference to this aspect and this approach, it's like, how can we look at where we are? Like, we may know that. And for me, right, like with my journey, I feel like I was always blessed to have like this cognitive understanding of like how to connect to my emotions and like what my body was feeling. Like, my mother did a very good job, and also like allowed me to learn both aspects, and I see how that shaped me over the years. And then there was times that I 100% went onto one side of the scale and was just eating bull crap and like disconnecting from my body, but allowing that pendulum to just like completely release and like swing to the opposite side, and gain that understanding and that wisdom. And by going through Mexico and Costa Rica and Colombia and all these different ways and connecting with these indigenous communities, it's really this understanding that wildness is creating safety in that primal aspect of our brain. Because now it's like, in this Western time and in this day and age, we need science to prove things to us.
Yeah.
We need this neuroscience. I need to see the fMRI, MRI, to see it and say, oh, that's what's happening. It makes logical sense because I'm living up here. But it's like, truly, if we really sat back and sunk into ourselves, and to be realistic, a lot of parents don't have time, to go on retreats, to go do plant medicine, to go meditate, to connect, to pray, to connect to their yoni, all these different things. They don't have that time. So I get it, in living in this world and in this convenience of up here, what can we do? So I can 100% see how neuroscience can open up to that natural state. But it's like, we also have to invite ourselves to sink down deeper into the root, because also the exact same things that we're speaking about, authenticity and belonging, and what Gabor Mate was really saying is, it's connected to our root system, our energetic root, our sacrum, our root chakra. And these are where the things is where our body is growing up from, and those are those primitive primal aspects. And when you said that about in this amygdala, and where all of this action happens, and this primal state clicks back into there, it's almost like when a person or a parent doesn't have that capacity. And I'm just saying person in general, because this happens in relationship as well. It's like, you can't get into a partnership and you can't hold space for another person's emotion.
Right.
It's not to say that, oh, I'm going to take on your stuff and I have the capacity to hold it. It's like, hold space in a sense of, can I create a container around seeing that's your stuff and I can still be safe in my stuff, and it's an energetic thing, 100%. And I always explain to people, it's kind of like our central nervous system is wound up so tight, but the more we untighten it, the more our actual central nervous, like biologically and physiologically, our central nervous system can relax and it has more flow.
Yeah.
So it's almost like we have this fear of going back into that primal state and into that part of our brain, because it's unsafe there. Like, we feel so unsafe within our own brain, and just that we're up here, that we disconnect from the rest of the body. Because also in those other aspects of our body, especially down in the roots, we know that we're not secure. We know that we are not rooted. We may have a house, we may have a car, we may have a stable, bank account and a job and all these things, but that is all the external top of the iceberg. So now we're only seeing from that aspect. So when are we actually really connecting from the roots? Just like when we're going back to this natural state of, when we look at and observe trees are not connected by the canopy. Like, some of them are interconnected, but that is not how they communicate. They communicate through roots.
Right.
That is where all the information is connected through. So it's like inviting these parents into this aspect to really create a sense of safety. It's not an action of safety. It's not a behavior of safety or a behavior of protecting, or a habit of being safe. It's like feeling actually safe in your roots, so that you can create that connectedness for your child to actually root and plant as well. because if not, they're going to consistently feel that unsafety and that sense of not coming back to being natural and not being stabilized. And that same sense of, the central nervous system kind of doing this, and it's like it's not on either side. It's like I found that balance and I found that harmony to actually root down and grow and actually have your child grow up, and because we were having this, I guess, taught, flared imprint of growing up so fast, we just grew up anywhere. So we never actually rooted. We actually were never planted, And I see that concept within, our indigenous tribes all throughout the world. They, even with, let's even go down into the placenta, when a child is born, they take the placenta and they plant it near a tree. It's this sense of belonging in the earth, and then these children are raised in these specific ways, but also very natural and very wild, some may say. But it's like shifting your perspective of what you see as a wild child. And even if you were connected, and called a wild child, it's like, what do I feel about that name? What do I feel about that word? So that when I look at my child, I can allow them to be wild because I have that feeling. So now my action towards them shifts, because it's my habit. And I've already learned how that behavior is okay. And it's like telling ourselves that whole line of being a wild child is okay. Being a child that has ADHD is okay because my child was labeled this or diagnosed this or was born like this. It's okay. They are safe in this world because I have a safety in my own belonging and my own authenticity. And I'm going to also plant that and nourish my child and nurture them with that same, water, with that same sentiment, with the same words, with the same care. And I feel like in that, these children with these differences can grow up in a space that's so separate and is seemingly together and like unified and communal. They can see their difference because it is a difference and be okay with it and live in that authenticity and see it as a gift to be expressed, And I feel like that is such a huge part to shifting our children out from this survival state, within ourselves, because we are clinging on so much to that fear of dropping back into that amygdala and dropping back into that primal state of ourself because we're so afraid. Now, when I look at my child and if they're being so afraid and I can see them clinging on to that like authenticity and that belonging and, all of these other things, like I want to ask you, when children are clinging on to that, they're clinging on to that sense of belonging, they're clinging on to that authenticity. How does a parent, or what do you see in a sense of neuroscience and also like spirit and just, authentic leadership, how do we clear up that disorientation that comes out from the world, or that has been, like you said, that incoming frequency? How do we clear up that vision so that our child can actually gain some clarity through that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know that I've figured it out yet, but even what you were speaking on before, I think it ties into this question, and it's really hard for me to talk about this topic without also acknowledging the systems that we do live in, right? And like, if so many parents are in this state of survival, it's really hard to hold that space for their kids in the way that, especially kids that have these higher needs, to give that attention not only to themselves but then also to their children. And I think, we have to acknowledge that like we live in societies that were set up for us to be isolated, like we were never supposed to raise families as even two parents in one house or one parent in one house. Like it wasn't, we've lost in so many aspects this communal way of raising children. It was not something that was ever just put single-handedly on one person until a really, really long time. And I recently read a book that talked about like Christianity and Catholicism being one of the reasons for that, like segregation. It had to do with like buying land based on religion. And so it kind of started this separation of family that has evolved into what it is today. And so I think that's a really important piece of that. You know, it is really important for parents to take accountability for what they're able to. And it also, it's not like it's just their fault, you know, in a lot of ways. It's like these societal pressures, like it's really hard, at least for kids in the States who have these higher needs, to get resources in schools. You know, I'm working with a child right now that's like one more boleto, one more notice in this school away from being expelled. And the family here doesn't have a lot of money. Like, what are their other options going to be? So it's also like, yeah, there is this piece of accepting kids for who they are, and that's 100% important in what I teach and what I try to instill in people. And also there's this acknowledgement that like we live in a system that makes that really fucking hard for a lot of people to do. And so, yeah, this question of like, now I forgot the question that you asked. Sorry.
Like it's 100%. It's the sense of like creating clarity for the distortion. Like, so as parents, we grew up in this system and we see the distortion, but it's almost like we allowed this distortion into us to change who we are. And then we started adapting to change ourselves. And it's like, now if we're coming to that realization, how do we, either in a neuroscientific aspect and also a spiritual, so both of those balance, like where have you seen that harmony for a parent to see through that and create that for their child, create that clarity to say, okay, there is this world and there is this world, and you exist in both and you belong in both, and you have an authentic expression and an authentic presence in both as well. How do you see, like, I mean, I definitely know that neuroscience has not explained that yet, because it's a definite like piece of presence of humanity, and I'm not gonna go there. But what would be your advice for a parent to convey that to their child?
You have to be willing to do the work yourself. It has to start with you, because like the way I shared, I'm not a parent yet, and I think that in a lot of ways that's been a really helpful perspective when I work with parents, because it tells me that like getting angry at a child for doing X, Y, and Z is completely subjective, right? Like the reaction to a behavior is subjective because the parent gets mad or they feel shame or they want to punish or whatever it is. And for me, as someone who's just working with the kid, can see that as completely neutral, right? I can understand, okay, well, there's something they're not. Here's the thing, it's like a reframe. So I think neuroscience really helps. Like one of the first things I do with working with parents is helping them reframe some of these ideas that they have. And the thing with neuroscience and these neural pathways and neuroplasticity is like, you don't even have to believe the new thought that you say, that you replace, right? It's like, you just have to keep doing it over and over again. And eventually your brain starts to create that new neural pathway. So if you're thinking like, I've literally had parents come to me and say, I think my kid is an asshole. Like, I love them, but I don't like them, you know? Or like, oh, they're 7 years old and they're getting in trouble at school. And so that means they're never going to get married. They're never going to find a job. They're never going to go to college. They're never going to live on their own. And they have all of these things that they're projecting. And so like the first step is like, hold on. If we understand that kids are not their behaviors, that they're not intentionally trying to cause harm, that they're doing the very best with what they have at the moment, and so are their parents, then that one thing can shift every single other action and reaction and response that the parent has. So it's really coming from this place of understanding, okay, they're not giving me a hard time. My child is having a hard time. And so I think that shift where it stops becoming personal. It's like they're not doing it to you. Like, yeah, you might see these kids that are, you know, like they're sneaky and they know how to get what they want. And so parents label it as manipulative. And it's like, when you understand that their brain is literally just, it's not fully developed. Like they actually don't have the ability. It's like, if I were to say, okay, Max, like the rest of this interview, we have to do it in Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't start speaking to me in Japanese, then I'm like, okay, well, you go take a time out and like come back in 10 minutes. And then we come back and reset. And I'm like, okay, like now continue in Japanese. It's like, I have to change what my expectations are or let go of them altogether, right? Like
Yeah.
if I'm holding that from you and I know that you can't speak Japanese, that's really unrealistic and that's not
Right.
fair to you. So
Right.
it's like that's the first step, because I feel like it's just so ingrained that when these patterns are happening for so long with these parents that they're just like, yeah, it's personal and they're doing this to me and they're just trying to make my life miserable and they know how to get under my skin and push all my buttons. And it's like, if that's the perspective that you're gonna have, then nothing's going to change. So the very first step, I use neuroscience. Like we've got to rewire these neural pathways. Like it's a choice, you know, you can choose to make this decision. Like I'm going to choose to believe that my child is not doing this intentionally and that they are having a hard time and they're not giving me one. Because when you understand that, it's like, okay, now everything changes in how I'm going to respond to that behavior. And that's the first step. So if the parent isn't able to change their own responses, like genuinely, and not from that fake place that you're speaking of earlier, because kids, they're amazing at reading those body signals, and the tone of your voice and the way that you look at them. Like they know all those things. They're smart. We got to give them more credit. So that really is the first step. And then giving them tools like, I know we talked about micro moments before. You were like, I don't know what a micro moment is, but exactly like these parents are so busy. They don't have so much time to go to a retreat like you're saying, right? So it's like, I have a 10-second practice that I tell them like, okay, you just, when you wake up, when you're brushing your teeth, you ask yourself, am I red, am I yellow, or am I green? And red is like, I'm dysregulated, however that means to you. And I help them understand what that looks like. And right, yellow's in the middle, it's building that way, but green is like, okay, I can process information, I can take things in, and just doing that check throughout the day, not when you're in those places of dysregulation already, because we don't learn when we're in that place, which is also why when you're disciplining and yelling at your kids when they're doing something that's wrong or bad, quote unquote, like that's not the best time to teach them, because they can't take in new information, because again, their brain's not fully developed at that point. And they're in this state of fight or flight. So they're not learning, they're fleeing or freezing. So yeah, I would say neuroscience forms the basis of my work with them. And a lot of them do need that science perspective, right? And that is one thing that's shifting more in my work, is I'm realizing like I really want to call in the parents that are really ready and committed to drop into this work, because a lot of parents will say it, yes, I know it's me, I know I'm the one, I know it starts with me, but when it actually comes to facing it, it's still like, yeah, but fix my kid. Like, yeah, I'm here today, but it's because they're being a brat and I don't know what to do with them anymore. And so it's like, really, okay, like how much of a mirror are you willing to
Look into.
you know? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that. And I feel like that's like such a present state of where you're at right now, is like making that transition to be clear, you know, about what you were saying of these parents. And I think that is also one of the aspects of that balance and that harmony between the neuroscience and also the spirituality, or like your natural state, whatever, you know, you want to call it. It's looking at these parents, like you said, with neuroscience, you can keep saying something, but a key thing that you said was, I don't even have to believe that thought to change the brain. And I feel like that for me has been the biggest challenge with approaching the Western conditioned mindset, because I'm a huge believer of changing your perspective to shift your perception. And it's like, where I'm spectating from, wherever I'm at in my body in space and time, that's where my perception is going to be like a lens on that perspective. So if I'm looking from here, I'm looking through this lens. If I haven't changed this lens, and I can't change this lens because of whatever I'm believing from my thought, because I don't truly believe it, I'm out of center. Until I change my perspective, and I change my perspective from in my center, that perception can come back here. I can take it. But as long as I say, no, that belongs over here, and I know what that is, and I create a new lens of my perception to look out, then that seems more clear for me. And then I say, oh, okay, I can see this thing for what it is. I can see this person for who they are. I can see this situation for what it is. And that for me is like its truth, you know? So I'm not necessarily in that one aspect over here that I can't necessarily shift that perspective because I don't want to lie to myself. But I see that concept of, like you said, with these parents that come in that say, oh yeah, I know it's me. I know it's supposed to be love and light. And I know that I have to start here and it's all, but it's like you're unwilling. You're doing it with all your eyes closed because you don't want to look in the mirror.
Right.
Because it really comes down to it, and that child is showing you, or your partner is showing you, or your bank account is showing you who you truly are, you're afraid to look at that. So you shift back into that perception and you shift your perspective rather than coming into this perspective and saying, you know what, I'm looking at this, and even though I don't like it, I'm accepting it. And you start creating this perception, this lens of acceptance to see your child, to see your partner, to see this person that's, you know, cutting you off in line or pissing you off somewhere. It's like those points of what we call triggers. I like to see them as those flared imprints, because that flare that comes, it's like it's an opportunity for you to burn something that is clouding judgment, you know, that has been that lens. It's there to like really pierce that veil and to look into you and see who and how you are. And I feel like as parents and as humans, this is what we can really start to understand, is that by taming the truth, it's almost like telling the truth, you know? It's like we have to tell ourselves the truth of who we truly are, and also tell that truth, you know? Allow your kids to know these certain things. Allow your kids to see this system for what it is. Don't place a judgment and say, oh, well, yeah, the school system isn't really anything, but you have to go to school because that's what it is. Like, don't shift it like that. Just say, hey, this is what school is. This is the academics. This is a way of learning. You're also going to learn different ways. And, you know, as you start to grow up, you're going to learn different ways of how you learn, but also how do you feel like you learn? What are the different learning, you know, receptivities, you know, the audio learner, visual learner, experiential learner, like however, have those conversations with your children, you know, and I think it's the same way with parents as well. I mean, with partners as well. It's like, when I step into a partnership, like, yeah, you have to ask that same person, you know, these questions. How do you learn? How do you love? How do you receive? How do you give? You know, it's all about, like you said, I can't, and it's you're doing that for yourself, but it's a way of also expressing it back out into the world, because by asking those questions, I'm also gaining information so that I don't have any expectations. I'm not speaking Japanese to you and expecting you to speak Japanese back to me. You know, if I walk into a ceremony and I'm in Colombia, what am I going to expect them to speak English? You know, like, no, they're expecting me to speak Spanish because of where we are relatively, you know?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times what happens, especially with children and with parents, they're two different ways. And if you have this hierarchy, like I'm a parent and you're a child, like, you know, that Trunchbull kind of like situation, Matilda, I'm big, you're small, I'm small, you're dumb, and all that stuff.
Right,
Like,
you're wrong. And there's nothing you
yeah,
can do about it.
exactly. And that is that aspect, like you can do nothing about it. And I think that's where that concept, cognitively, that power shift happens, because there's always a power dynamic in any relationship, like you said, with community and relation. It's two people or more, you know, whether it's a partner, it's your boss, it's your child, whatever it is, there's that sense of power. And if we don't acknowledge that power and how we're handling that power and how we handle power, period, whether we have it or we feel like we don't have it, we have to learn how to reclaim that power for ourselves center that self, and also look at this next person. And if we have that consciousness as a parent, you have that consciousness and you grew and you awoke, you've waken up to all these different things, you have to communicate that to your child. You can't just be up here and live like they're down here. Bring yourself to that balance and meet that child where they are to create that environment. And then through that environment, that's when you're able to speak that same language, and then also receive that same language from them, free of expectations and free of that there's nothing you can do about it, like that taming of them. Because for me, that is what like invites them. And this is what I've pulled, like, especially from you, which is why I wanted to have this conversation, is because this sense of like being a wild child, and I 100% subscribe to that. Like, I was a wild child, my mother was a wild child, and I feel like embracing that and reclaiming that cognitive power and also that spiritual power of what that word means to us, and also how we express it, can start to really open up those deeper centers of our own authenticity, and also giving a belonging to the wild child in this new world. Because I feel like this world 100% needs wild children,
Yeah.
It's really an invitation to bring us back to that spirit and bring us back to that nature of being wild, and knowing that it's safe and that it's okay and that it's loved and that it's accepted, because it's healing that primal amygdala aspect of our brain where we don't feel like it's safe. We feel powerless. We feel like we're not good enough. And rather than continuously projecting that into our prefrontal and like out into the conscious world, it's like, can we actually almost take our children's hands and like allow them to walk us back into that primal aspect of ourselves and see it as an invitation? And I think that a lot of the work that you're doing and finding the purpose and finding the passion and how you want it to look and being creative with it right now is like, it's so paramount to everything that you're sharing with not just children, but with parents, and making that impact, and ultimately when you do become a parent, it's going to be so much more of a impact in that way, because you'll also be experiencing these things as well, and I feel like just everything that you shared, so many people can find value in that, and they can 100% benefit from that work. So I want to encourage anybody that's listening that is a parent, if you have trouble with this and you feel like your kids are, your personal pisser offers, and they're pointing at you and they're doing all this shit and they're fucking with you and they pushing your buttons, like, have a conversation with Christine, like gain some of these insights for yourself, gain some of these tools so that you can get a little bit out of your mind, connect with your body and connect with your spirit, and learn how to open up and surrender a little bit more. So Christine, if somebody was interested in that, like, how could they reach out to you? What are some of the things that I know you mentioned, like one-on-ones, like what does that look like? Where can they find you, and how can they get in contact with you?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at wildchildwhisperer.com. I mean, not .com, at wildchildwhisperer. My website is my first and last name, ChristineBinko.com. TikTok as well, Wild Child Whisperer. And yeah, even if you're not a parent, I'm starting to open it up into reparenting, to doing this inner child work. So whether it's just you're realizing you're stuck in a lot of places, you're realizing there's more of you that wants to express yourself, there's these parts that you're discovering or have yet to discover, but that deep down are there. That's the work that has been starting to call me more and more with like not parents. But yeah, I do series here in Costa Rica that are in person in groups, a parent coaching series. And then my one-on-ones are a container based on a framework that I've developed called Rooted Resolutions. And so it goes back to what we were talking about, right, around neuroscience, around getting to the root of these behaviors. And so the very first part of that starts with the parent. And so that they're the roots there. We got to go down. We got to figure out how to help them regulate. We got to help them figure out what their regulation tools are, so that they can then co-regulate and show up for their kids. And so then we move on through the framework into how do we bring that sense of curiosity and compassion and get curious about what your child's behaviors are actually trying to express, what are they actually trying to say. And then further down into the framework, we get into this collaboration piece, because I feel like that's really important. We didn't touch on that so much, but kids are also really wise, and they have a lot of wisdom, and they have a lot of amazing ideas for solutions. And so what I help parents do is get out of this place of assumption, and teachers as well, right? That we're assuming, oh, if they're doing this, then it means this. And sometimes when you talk to the kids, like, they come up with a completely different idea that solves the problem that you never even thought of, because you're so serious and not playful. And, you know, they just have this idea of the way things should be. And they're like, no, mom, no, dad, like, how about we do it like this? How about, what if we have a dance party while I'm doing my homework? And it's like, if that works for them, if that's what stimulates their brain, like, that could be the solution, and you never even knew it. So, and that was another thing that you touched on at the end there, was around, you know, these indigenous cultures, and modeling and including their children is and has been such an important part of their parenting, right? Like, making the kids feel included and part of something, and giving them a sense of purpose and meaning to their life. And not just being the one who does all the responsibilities in the house, but when they're young, even 2 years old, they can start helping in a way that's meaningful. Not that you have to do this, but you're a part of something. You mean something. You contribute to this family, this unit. So that's the work that I do in my one-on-one containers, and yeah, a lot of deeper inner child reparenting work, connecting to nature, connecting with our ancestors, thinking about these patterns as part of our ancestry and our lineages, that now as these cycle breakers, we have the strength, we have the abilities, the access to knowledge that other people in our lineage didn't have. So this is the time where we get to break a lot of shit. And I'll also just add that it's so funny you brought up Matilda, because I did an inner child somatic practice a couple of weeks ago, and like Matilda, it was the image that came through, or like that song Send Me On My Way comes on. She's like, you know, moving all the stuff around the room, and I'm like, yeah, I'm fucking Matilda. She is my, like, yeah, when I think of a movie, like, that's the energy I want to embody.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Utilizing that internal power to control your environment. I love it. I love it. And yeah, I feel like that's a beautiful thing for people to have too. And just to see that you're in that transformative state right now, that even though, like, this is a part of you being, you know, like, even though you've learned all these things, and now you're also evolving and expanding into, just from children to parents to now even people that are re-parenting, but also like pre-parenting, like people that are preparing to have children, and like, let me sort through all of this shit first before I bring this child into this world, because I know it's beneficial to me, and I also see that's going to be beneficial to them. And I feel like that's such an amazing offering to bring to people now, and another creative expression and another outlet to really just show your level of channeling this creative energy to actually create something that's different and still live in your purpose and still live in your passion. And yeah, we definitely got to get you back on and definitely dive a little bit deeper into those aspects of like what it looks like to once you get to that point of regulating yourself and then seeing it in your child, and also like, okay, what does that next step of collaboration looks like, you know? And I'm 100% believer in that. And like I released the episode a few weeks ago about the word contribute, and in the word it's tribe, you know, and that's really what tribe is. It's like how we contribute to our community, to our family, to our immediate connection. So I would love to, you know, have you back on, and we can go a little bit into that and talk about the collaborative nature between children and parents. So yeah, other than that, I thank you guys so much for tuning in. Thank you so much, Christine, for having yet another beautiful conversation, like so in depth and so concise. And I just completely admire you as the therapist, as the space holder, as the healer, as the conveyor that you are. And I think that the work that you're doing is so impactful, extremely amazing, and so needed in this world. And I'm just completely grateful for you that you exist, that we connected in Costa Rica, that you came and experienced a bodywork session on the beach with me. And it ultimately led to this. Yes. And it ultimately led to this, and I'm just happy that everybody that's listening right now is receiving this, and there will be definitely more on Frequently Speaking. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your energy. Thank you so much for your attention. And all her contact information will be down in the details and in the little bio situation we have there. So thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you so much, Christine. And I'll see you guys on the next one. Ciao.
If you like this episode and would like to explore more perspectives like this with me, as we get a bit more intimate and intricate look into our internal vibrations, be sure to tune in to next week's episode and subscribe for more. Until then, keep frequently speaking what you frequently see.